Matt, thank you so much for that generous introduction. And I would never consider myself your boss. We're clearly colleagues. And just to add, I do work in one of the major trauma centres in Manchester. And so it's a great delight to come and speak at this meeting, both in terms of orthopaedic trauma, but also the broader offer around patient pathway care. And I think you've had Ian speak earlier on today, I think, about perioperative pathways, which are clearly very important as a multidisciplinary team. Now, I've got to start by saying thank you. Thank you from the NIHR and thank you from the NHS. This has been an extraordinarily challenging and difficult period. We've all worked together in very difficult circumstances, managing not only patients with COVID-19, particularly at the severe end of the spectrum in our setting in critical care, but also on the ward, but actually keeping trauma services going, which has been tremendously difficult. So I'm quite aware of all the efforts that everyone's made. And frankly, what efforts you've made to keep research going in trauma care pathways during this period. Clearly, as an important surgical emergency, it didn't go away. And so maintaining research has been really important, and thank you. But I think during this period of patients with severe respiratory infectious illness, there's no doubt that as a system in the UK, we've developed world-class research in diagnostic testing, in treatments, and vaccine to get us out of this outbreak and some semblance of getting back to normal business, whatever that's going to look like. Now, clearly there's been a cost to this and an interruption to business as usual, not only for services, but for our research portfolios. And I'm sure it's impacted on yours. It's certainly impacted on ours in critical care. And we're scrambling now to try and reignite our former studies and get new studies going. But there's very much been a step change in innovation and collaboration, which I think has really accelerated the pace of research and frankly, the future expectation. But I think we also must be mindful that research has been displaced and frankly, the workforce are drained and in an urgent need of restoration and renewal. So I think that's something that we need to think about very carefully. Now, we've been well positioned in the UK, as you will know, as well as I, since 2006, and Best Research for Best Health. For those of you that are as old as I am, you might remember this document, and then the formation of the most integrated health service research service or system within the globe. And I think the fact that we had that in place, that we had a workforce, and that we were able to pivot pretty quickly actually has been remarkable. I will mention briefly the importance of top-down management in this. And, you know, I think none of us have ever worked under these circumstances, at least in research, unless I guess you're in the military. You know, being told by the chief medical officer that we need a deliverable research portfolio to get out of this pandemic, and that's all we're going to do for the moment, is you know, pretty difficult to swallow when you've got to drop important research in patients that you're looking at in front of you during pandemic. But we did it, and I think we did it with great success. But I think there is a time to reflect on what was achieved and what we need to learn from this. Clearly, the past year has highlighted the pace and extent to which health technologies are developing. Quite remarkable. But there are clear lessons, I think, that we need to learn, which can be applied to the future. I'd like to propose, and I don't think this is a dangerous statement, that research is probably the single most important way in which we've improved healthcare over this pandemic period. I would argue before as well, but certainly in pandemic, it's visible what research has done in terms of saving life, improving survivorship, and protecting populations from a very dangerous infection. So there seems to me to be a very strong case to embed research in routine clinical services in the NHS and social care, actually, as we move forward. So we have now, I think, a window of opportunity to develop an agenda with, I think, high-level support, but we're going to need a whole system response. And so we have that. We have that vision. You may have seen this document that was released at the end of March. If you haven't, it's available freely on websites at the Department of Health and the NIHR. And it's a 20-odd page document that sets a vision to fill this gap of embedding research as we move out of pandemic and into a new era. I think that the report makes a clear case for expanding health and care research. It highlights the opportunities that I think are created by emerging technologies. And we've certainly seen the importance of genomics, imaging, and advanced therapies, and I would argue data analytics and increasingly artificial intelligence. Things that we've been discussing before, but I think things that are now coming into the fore. I think this report makes a clear link between increased research participation and better outcomes, better health outcomes across services, which is really important, and points out that research can be used as a mechanism to address health inequalities and a driver for inclusion for underserved communities. And I'll come back to that later on in the talk. It also presents, in my mind, a very clear economic case for expanding clinical research. And I'm not going to go through that now, but you will be already versed in some of the fabulous investments that have happened in the UK in past years, and we need to build on those, particularly from the life science and commercial sectors. So I think this vision also recognized the key importance of the workforce. I've mentioned our exhausted workforce, but I think it really does embrace some of those things, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And I think the system needs to develop more resilience, and I'm not absolutely clear how that is proposed in this document, but that might be a subject for further discussion. Now, key to this vision are sort of 5 thematic areas that sort of underpin what I've just been talking about. And I'm not going to go through this in any great detail, but it may be promote some questioning later. Clearly, I've tried to identify that a case is made to embed research in NHS practice, and that's not going to be straightforward. So to enable that, we have to invest in people. We have to make sure services are commissioned and understand the importance of research within those commissioned services. Research needs to be patient-centered. So patients have got to want to do research. They see this as important. We had no difficulty in recruiting patients to vaccine studies to prove rapidly that vaccines worked. And so patients or populations wanted to be engaged in that. We want to, in my view, celebrate equipoise. That's a really difficult one that sometimes we don't know, and that we should share that position of uncertainty with patients and use that as a quality within our services, and explain to patients how we're addressing them and how we're addressing them for the benefit of those services and those pathways. I'll come on to the issues of inclusion and underserved communities shortly. There is quite a bit about streamlining research. There's a lot of aspiration here. Things happen quickly in pandemic. we have to remember there were 6,000 studies on the CRM portfolio just before pandemic. And at any one moment during pandemic, we were conducting about 50 to 60. So the resources of the NIHR were focused on a very small number of studies. So we've got to think about what will efficiencies look like in the future as we regrow our portfolios. And I'm sure there's many examples in your own field about a particularly follow-up, a remote follow-up, efficient use of data to underpin outcomes. But actually capturing patients in the first place can be quite challenging. How we develop perhaps screening tools. And then also the methods that we're using to investigate interventions. I'll come on to the methods and possibly some of the things we've learned or we haven't learned during pandemic later on. Data and digital tools are clearly very important. I don't need to persuade you of that. But we're not in a great position at the moment in the NHS, and you only have to look at the press over the last few days about the challenges in community care and getting populations to understand the importance of data sharing. We seem to make the same mistakes time and time again, and there's more to do. And then finally, the theme around workforce, which I'll come back to. Now, this vision will be delivered not as a cost-neutral endeavor. It's my belief that there needs to be investment in this vision. And all I can say is that investment comes in different guises. It's subject to political spending reviews and efficiencies. But I think we do need investment. We also need to build on our current commitments. We need to build on our commitments to the life science sector, which frankly have sagged during pandemic, and we need to rebuild that. And we need to be cogent of the NHS long-term plan, and particularly patients living with multimorbidity, long-term conditions, and interaction with mental health. Very important. And within this document, there are some specific action areas. You can read those at your leisure, but I'm not going to go through them in detail today. But probably it's worthwhile touching on some of the progress that has been made around these actions during pandemic and over the last few weeks. So thinking about clinical research embedded into the NHS, big challenge, but you know, it's something that we need to take on as professionals. Clearly, people that are tuned into this broadcast are on side. The Orthopaedic Trauma Society is on side, as are the trials in orthopaedic trauma surgery. We've got to persuade our colleagues. This has got to be part of routine practice. We need the regulators on board, so we're not stumbling all the time over iterations and delays around getting our research into practice. And I think there's things went well during the pandemic in that regard, but we hope that they don't revert to business as usual. I'll perhaps come back to that. We need to partner professional organizations. Now, the NIHR have a traditional strong affiliation with the Royal College of Physicians, who provide leadership in a number of areas. But I think being invited to meetings such as this is very important. So all societies and all Royal Colleges and faculties need to share this vision and ambition. And I think getting out to talk in this environment is really important, because it's us at the coalface that are going to make the difference here, and particularly around changing hearts and minds. We do have a very active engagement team with the NHS at the NIHR, and they are vigorously working with NHS chief executive officers and R&D senior directors to get this get things progressed. And there is enormous amount of work going on in that space that I don't think is seen. But what we're hoping is that within your own organizations, that doors slowly are opened to you and to your research. And I think the carrot-shaped stick that we're very keen to progress with the Care Quality Commission to align research as an indicator of care quality is going to be really important in this. I'm just going to briefly touch on research in the community. Now, we're all based in secondary and tertiary care, but of course our patients are largely based in the community and come and see us for short periods of time during their pathway. And I think I would encourage you to have a look at this new strategy that's been developed by one of my colleagues, another co-cluster lead, Professor Phil Evans, who's an academic GP. This has just been announced, and we do have to look very carefully at how our research in secondary and tertiary care interacts with this plan. This vision is going to be very important, and I think will come with some substantial care and research funding. So we need to look at that. Now, in terms of patient-centered research, I'm just going to focus on inclusion and underserved populations at this point. There's no doubt that COVID-19 has exposed great inequalities in health and access to healthcare, which is hugely disappointing to us as a wealthy nation, I think. Now, for the last few years, we've been working hard, and I've been working with this group, particularly around patients who lack capacity, to look at guidances to include patients in research that we underserved. Now, you can find all the documents online at the NIHR, and there is a roadmap that we've produced that has been communicated for usual business, business as usual research, but also in the setting of COVID, because that was very important. Now, these kind of documents can be a bit turgid, but I will say that they have been taken up by our colleagues in the equality, diversity and inclusion part of the NIHR, and already have been implemented to good effect. Now, I was hoping to show you a slide from a big pharmaceutical company who are active in the field of late phase trials in breast cancer, who have just taken on this whole end-to-end process to deliver a trial for patients where inclusion was going to be really difficult, so a big underserved population. And it's delivered to time and target, and it is quite a remarkable story. Unfortunately, the slide's not been signed off, but look out for that piece of work, because I think this is really going to take traction. And I think one of the things that you do need to think about when you're putting in bids for your own research, certainly within NIHR and charitable sectors in the UK, you really do need to pay attention to these frameworks and roadmaps, because the funders are going to take significant attention to this. So think about what underserved looks like in your particular piece of research, and tell the funders how you're going to tackle it. So streamlined and efficient innovation for research is crucially important. There's so much we could talk about there. But probably the elephant in the room is the platform trial. So I'm not going to thrust down your neck platform trials that have delivered during COVID, the principle in the community, recovery in hospital care and in the wards, and then interfaced into ICU with REMAP CAP. I think we have learned things from those as late phase repurposed therapy trials, but there are all sorts of challenges around how those therapies then get their licenses, etc. I mean, most of the therapies that we've brought through are under emergency licensing. But I've chosen to look at a call that's just been announced that I thought might illustrate some of the things that we need to think about moving forward. And this is actually more of a discovery platform. So looking at finding new treatments and understanding symptoms and mechanisms in the setting of chronic pain, something that you probably see within some of your trauma services and certainly some of your musculoskeletal services. So this is a very interesting call because it has been built by industry, it's been built by patient advocacy groups, and it's brought together a whole host of funders from biology through to medical research, but also includes social sciences and also psychological sciences. And this aims to build an infrastructure with consortia that will deliver on a host of fronts around the huge grand challenges of chronic pain. I think this is really interesting, and how data architecture will be built, how groups will be brought together with certain skills in the UK, and actually how this platform eventually will service an international community. So I think have a look at this because it is fascinating. Maybe some of you are already involved in these consortia. This is a funded competition, not a slam dunk piece of funding to a group of people that think they could deliver this. This is about bringing people together and developing consortia. So I think that's really important. The other final thing I would say about this slide is about thinking about the vision, the workforce, the next generation, the opportunities to train are all embedded in this. So this isn't just a delivery process, it is an architecture to foster training. So I think that's really important. So I'm not going to say much about digital tools or data. You will know plenty about this, particularly in terms of extracting your outcome data from NHS Digital and ONS. But what I will say is that I think the NIHR have an urgent need to develop their digital platforms. And so we now have an NIHR digital department. It's headed by John Norrie, who's come out of industry, was appointed during pandemic, and at the end of June we'll have a business case to deliver a more integrated and digitally facing NIHR. And there's some of the areas that I think you might see in this business case. He's managed to raise £10 million that he needs to spend by next year. So he's under a lot of pressure to deliver. And I can only hope that this will produce a step change in the opportunities for us as researchers. And finally, I'm going to just mention something about sustaining the workforce. Now, I think Matt's done a great job with you developing opportunities with the Associate PI scheme. Trauma and emergency care is part of an early adopter there. And I'm sure you have experience in your own centres of using. So I think this is a really important project to bring on PIs from our non-research active colleagues. And that could be multidisciplinary and not just clinicians. The clinician researcher credentialing is just being launched. We're about to start a pilot. It is headed up by the Royal College of Physicians, but there is a call out at the moment for higher education providers, which has just closed, where the credentialing pathways will be eventually delivered by higher education providers. And it's a modular-based system where people in their mid-career of clinical practice, and again from the multidisciplinary workforce, can develop, perhaps new to research actually, can develop their credentialing as learning within studies within the NHS. And I think that's going to be really important. And finally, just to mention the clinical research practitioner scheme, which is starting to acknowledge and bring on people that may not have clinical training or qualifications or association with Royal Colleges, often from science backgrounds, who are coming into the NHS to support research and its delivery. And that's, I think, is another very important initiative. So watch this space. So what's going to happen next? So in terms of the vision, there's an oversight board has been configured with a series of working groups. It's closely aligned to the Recovery, Resilience and Growth workstream at the Department of Health and Social Care. So this has top-level oversight at ministerial level, actually. I think the vision is extremely ambitious and rather heavily dependent on whole system engagement, both health and social care, and is going to involve an extensive range of stakeholders, including the funders of research, whether they be in industry, charitable sectors, or otherwise. I think there are concerns about parts of the system that might revert to normal business. So if we consider regulators and commissioners, I mean, frankly, it's possible that they just go back to business as usual. So we've got to really focus on that area to make sure that we do learn well from pandemic when they perform very well for us and our patients, and maintain that. So that's going to be something that we need to keep an eye on. But I think the key battle is one of hearts and minds. So we've got to really encourage every part of the system. And frankly, we've got to do that probably bottom up. So while we're within our day jobs, this has got to be front and center of what we're trying to achieve. So I think, you know, every stakeholder in the NHS and social care, whether it be patients or their carers, and those interested in clinical research delivery, really need to get behind this very ambitious vision. So I'll stop there, Matt, if that's okay. Thank you.
Paul, that was fantastic. Wow, you've covered covered everything we could possibly ask for there, and a whole lot more as well. So if you have questions for Paul, please do put them in the chat, and I'll try and read those as I go along. Paul, I could spend all day talking to you about this. There's so much happening, so much to discuss. I guess one thing that struck me, and you touched upon this in your talk there, was that I guess there's never been a higher profile for UK research than there is now, both with the public and with government. The pandemic and the UK's world-leading response to that in terms of research into COVID has put the research that was previously, I think, under-recognised in this country front and centre. Yet, ironically, the ability to take advantage of that in terms of new investment and pushing to expand what we do has never been lower, because the country's pretty much broke. How can we take advantage of this raised profile of clinical research in the UK?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Matt, and I kind of did allude to it a bit around it. It does need investment, and I think that we're going to have to be very creative about that investment. We've always made the case to government that the life science sector is very important, and when you look at the CRN returns over the years, the investment that's come from the life science sector into the NHS, and access to devices, access to therapies, etc., at good prices is very important, and sustaining jobs. So we have possibly a workforce skills shortage at the moment, but the universities are going to be churning out graduates and highly skilled graduates. So I think this is a really, really important area to focus on in terms of future employment, actually. So it's at the heart, I think, of the business opportunity, and particularly and I'm not going to tell you which way I voted, but as we've left Europe, or at least the European Union. So there are some huge challenges there, but it could be that this vision is at the centre of how we rescue ourselves from both the pandemic and to a certain degree from Brexit, actually. So, and I think ministers, as they have always supported, or at least in spending reviews, not reduced the value of the investment into the NHS, social care and research. I think that's at least got to be maintained, if not grown. What I can see is a refashioning a little bit of what we do. I've got more of that to talk to you about over the coming weeks. But what I can promise you is, however the CRN may or may not be reorganized around this vision, I think specialties are going to be really important, and that's something we can campaign through all the way through. And frankly, the only way we got out of this pandemic was because we had highly skilled people from various specialties advising, and you were one of those.
Paul, I think it's a really great point. I think there's an opportunity, I think, even in the face of that, inevitable austerity we're going to suffer as a country for the next few years, for all the reasons that you alluded to there, that we can push this agenda that research actually saves you money as well. I mean, back to Sally Davis's original premise for the National Institute for Health Research is the health and wealth of the nation, that research actually saves you money in the long term, as well as being good for the health of the country as well. I think one thing that's the pandemic's brought home to me, and particularly the redistribution of the research, is that I think even before COVID, the network was struggling to deliver all things to all people. And I know I'm sure you won't be drawn on this, but the future network, do you think we are going to have to streamline what we're delivering and the sort of studies, the sort of projects that we're actually taking, join the portfolio in the future?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that is yes. And I don't mind saying that we're not going to bring back a 6,000 study portfolio. And I think that's widely known. We have to look at where the value of the investment is best placed. Now, clearly, low-level observational studies are crucially important for hypothesis generating. But if they are part of a small-scale project in a handful of hospitals where the ambition is not to really generate hypotheses that could be tested at huge scale, the question is, what is the value to that project and also to the NIHR in supporting that? And it may be that those kind of projects, which traditionally might have sat on the portfolio, may not return in time. I think the focus is going to be very much on delivering multi-center studies that are either hypothesis generating or practice changing.
Thanks, Paul. There's lots of questions coming in. I'm afraid we won't have time for all of these that arrived already, but just a few that I'll pick out from here. One very pertinent, you mentioned very clearly embedding research within the NHS as a whole. It's not a research delivery arm versus the rest of the NHS, it's an NHS project. But colleagues are pointing out that actually not everyone is funded, particularly on the clinical staff, for delivering research, and indeed can't fit it into their day job. How do we incentivize clinicians to take a lead on the research rather than just passively letting it happen around them?
Yeah, perhaps this is not deflecting the question, but have a look at the primary care community strategy, where commissioning and funding flows in very different ways. And you'll never get a GP because of their funding system to do this unless they're paid to do it. And so there's a very clear statement in that document about making sure it's in job plans and paid for. So I think that's what we have to do in secondary and tertiary care, that this is not an add-on or something nice to do. This is something that everyone should be appraised about, is probably part of revalidation, and is paid for in your contract, if we believe in this vision.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I guess the people listening today are probably the converts that are already engaged in that. And I think we've got a really great engagement within the orthopedic trauma community, but there's more our colleagues, should be involved in this really. And I think probably have an obligation to be involved in research as well. So I couldn't agree more. Question about data access. You mentioned again, Paul, and the steps forward that have happened during the pandemic in terms of our linkage of data, our use of big data. Are you optimistic, is the question, about that this will continue in the future?
I want to be optimistic. So there's no doubt that your colleagues at Oxford, Matt, have been ahead of the game with the DigiTrials platform. But I think Professor Landry and his team will be the first to admit that that's been quite helpful to the recovery trial. But in terms of what can be learnt and how that can be expanded, is probably quite limited. And in fact, we need a whole systems change to do this at scale that's going to foster delivery of data into trials in the way that we would all hope and expect. So I think I think there are some very significant challenges, and I don't want to underestimate those. And even within pandemic, outside of some of the main platform trials, some very important trials, have had a challenging time getting outcome data actually. The importance of getting outcomes and results back into care pathways is crucial. And if we found it difficult during pandemic, I think we've still got a lot of work to do. I hope that's sufficient to ask your question.
No, absolutely. I think it's a very balanced answer. I think we're all cautiously optimistic, which I think you summed up very nicely there. Just a follow-up question on that from Chris, who's asking about the recent unhappiness, widely reported unhappiness about the NHS data and access to that. But that's so important to be able to use big data for research purposes. The question is, what is the NIHR's role in that debate? Are we best off out of that, or do we need to be central to that debate of privacy versus the use of big data for the benefit of patients?
Well, I think we have to be central to that debate, and certainly there is great effort going on. It certainly went on in pandemic between the Urgent Public Health group led at the top end by Chris Whitty, and trying to make those arguments. And in fact, the law was changed under the COPI regulations to allow data access for the purposes of urgent public health. So there is some precedent there, but we have to continue, in my view, making that claim continually that these data have huge value to those patients that exist beyond just their immediate care, and that actually research could potentially transform their outcomes and their care and their outcomes. And I think it's only the NIHR that is going to make that argument. I mean, I would suggest looking around the four nations, because Scotland have always done quite well at this, and there are some very good examples of how data which is owned within their health boards has been used for good effect. And maybe we need to learn from other jurisdictions. That's just an observation.
Brilliant, sir. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think NIHR does need to be central to that. It never ceases to amaze me how patients will give up their time and do extra tests and have extra investigations for the purposes of research, usually, if we're absolutely honest, to little benefit to themselves, but for the benefit of patients in the future. And they're happy to do that, and yet at a population level, we seem nervous about sharing data for the benefit of future patients. But I agree entirely, NIHR is central to that argument, I think, for the future. Paul, I think we could talk all day, but I'm very, very grateful to you for giving up your time today. I know exactly how busy you are and have been over the last year in particular, dealing with everything you've gone through and with all your work with NIHR as well. So very much appreciated on behalf of the whole of the orthopaedic trials community.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you very much for the invitation. And I'll speak with you and your colleagues very soon. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Paul.